Hey, welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Got a lot coming up for you this hour. A little bit later on in the hour, we will be talking with Senator Marco Rubio. We will also be joined by Representative Dan Crenshaw, who will be joining us to talk about 9/11. So we have a lot coming up. It's a big hour. We begin at this hour with the continued fallout from the resignation/firing of John Bolton. And this does raise some questions about the future of American foreign policy because, you see, there is this debate, and it's been happening on the right really for the last 4 or 5 years. See, up to that point, there is a basic feel on the right, which is that the war in Iraq may have been pursued along the wrong lines, but that it was not the wrong thing to do. That George W. Bush did the right thing in going to war in Afghanistan, that overall he did the right thing based on the information he had to go to war in Iraq, that that war could have been won, that Barack Obama precipitously pulled out, thus creating defeat from the jaws of victory. Now, that was the basic Republican take. Then President Trump came along in 2016, and he decided to simply throw all of that out the window. Suddenly, the war in Iraq, it became sort of rote talking points on the right that the war in Iraq was bad. That it was a bad idea, it was always bad, it was wrongly pursued, and all of the rest. And that America needed to adopt a more isolationist foreign policy that looked a lot more Rand Paulian than it did like the sort of Bush administration interventionist side. Trump on foreign policy looked a lot more like the isolationists in the Republican Party than he did like the more sort of neocon or realist schools of the American foreign policy establishment. And that in and of itself represented a certain rethinking since 9/11, because after all, what 9/11 was supposed to do for a lot of people in America was reset what exactly we thought foreign policy was going to be. See, I remember 9/11, and so do you, most of the people listening. You remember that the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was this sudden realization that withdrawing from the world did not mean that the world was not going to come after you and try to hurt you. That withdrawing from the world in the 1990s, slashing the American military at historic rates, refusing to provide support to American allies abroad, failing to even really assess the risk factors in different places in the world, pretend that everybody was our friend, that came along with consequences. That shooting a missile at a medicine factory in Sudan was not actually going to forestall mass terrorism. After 9/11, we looked back and we saw all of these red flags. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing by al-Qaeda, the attacks on America's embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the USS Cole in 2000. We looked back at that and we said, oh, well, I mean, maybe we should have picked up on those breadcrumbs and done something about it before 3,000 Americans were slaughtered. And on the basis of that, America's foreign policy changed. We recognized that we might have to take preemptive steps in order to stop the possibility of terrorism going forward. And that was not unusual in American history. In the aftermath of World War II, America took a much more muscular position on the world stage. The idea was, well, turns out we probably shouldn't have gone to sleep for most of the 20s and 30s. That resulted in the bloodiest war in world history. Probably that was a bad idea. So instead, we are going to focus our time and attention on an interventionist foreign policy that builds up our allies. We will expend America's blood and treasure in order to do so, to make the world stronger, to ensure that our allies don't fall to the communist menace. And by the 1980s, the Soviet Union is on the ropes. And then the Soviet Union falls, and we go back to a sort of 1922 view of foreign policy. Well, that was the war to end all wars, wasn't it? Guess that's the end of history. We can withdraw from the world. And then 9/11 was a reminder. Well, no, when you withdraw the world, people clock you in the face. After 9/11, you'll recall George W. Bush got up. This would be September 21st, 2001, and he spoke at a joint session of Congress. And George W. Bush, who heretofore had looked on foreign policy a lot like Donald Trump does in 2015, 2016, right? George W. Bush came into office suggesting that we were going to redeploy American resources at home, suggesting that he was going to focus less on America's foreign policy abroad and more on American domestic policy. 9/11 happens, and Bush flips. And he says, you know, the Taliban are going to have to surrender al-Qaeda or we will come after them.
The leadership of al-Qaeda has great influence in Afghanistan and supports the Taliban regime in controlling most of that country. The United States respects the people of Afghanistan. After all, we are currently its largest source of humanitarian aid, but we condemn the Taliban regime. And tonight, the United States of America makes the following demands on the Taliban. Deliver to United States authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in your land.
Okay, and that was the demand. And now you fast forward 18 years, and President Trump is negotiating directly with the Taliban to go to Camp David, where they will sign some sort of agreement that amounts to America's withdrawal of troops without the Taliban acknowledging the legitimacy of the Afghan regime, and with a group of people who have never taken a break from bombing American targets, from trying to kill American soldiers, from trying to slaughter our allies. I mean, that's a sea change in how America and how the administrations have viewed foreign policy, right? It is a return to a pre-9/11 mindset. George W. Bush laid out the post-9/11 mindset 10 days after September 11th. He said, this isn't just going to be about retaliation and isolated strikes. This is going to be an interminable war. We're not going to like it, but that is the way things have to be.
Our response involves far more than instant retaliation and isolated strikes. Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign, unlike any other we have ever seen. And we will pursue nations that provide aid or safe haven to terrorism. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
On the basis of that understanding, Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State under George W. Bush, she was on CBS News this week, and she suggested, why in the world are we negotiating with the Taliban? Nothing has fundamentally changed over there.
Well, I'm relieved that we walked away from these talks. I always wondered if it was really possible to get a solution with a Taliban that is not really committed to peace. And there were some bad telltale signs. There's an Afghan government that has been there now as our ally for a decade and a half. And the Taliban says they don't recognize them, they won't talk to them. That's a bad sign.
Okay, and of course, she is exactly right. Well, the ouster of John Bolton, though, could signify a change in how that is viewed. So Bolton, of course, is a holdover from the Bush administration. Mike Pompeo is somewhat hawkish, not quite as hawkish as Bolton was. The question in Bolton's ouster is, was he ousted because of personality clashes with President Trump, or was he ousted because there are seriously different views of foreign policy inside the Trump administration? There's some pretty solid evidence to suggest that this was really more about personality than policy. According to the Washington Post, Bolton was clashing with members of the administration. He particularly was not willing to go out there and represent Trump's position if he disagreed with it on television, which to Trump is a sort of mortal sin. He apparently also was accused of leaking to the media that Vice President Pence and Bolton were on the same side on the Taliban peace deal, as opposed to Mike Pompeo. Pompeo and other members of the administration then allegedly, according to the Washington Post, went to Trump and accused Bolton of being a leaker and of undermining Trump's foreign policy and placing egg on Trump's face. That's something Trump obviously was not going to go along with. According to the Washington Post, among accumulated grievances that had been building for months, the president was annoyed that Bolton would regularly call on members of Congress to try to get them to push Bolton-preferred policies on Trump, according to a senior official who, like others, spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. Many on Bolton's handpicked staff were seen as unnecessarily confrontational with other parts of the national security bureaucracy. Apparently, there are a lot of people inside the Trump administration who are annoyed with Bolton. Pence, acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, apparently found Bolton increasingly abrasive and self-promoting. Pompeo and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin had told Trump that his national security advisor was not helping him. And you could see that, obviously, Pompeo and Mnuchin were pretty happy to see Bolton go. Here was Mike Pompeo talking about it yesterday with a big smile on his face.
Can you describe your working relationship with John Bolton as it was today? Sure. And also, sure. Does his departure make it easier for you to do your job and for the administration to accomplish the president's foreign policy agenda?
Look, I don't talk about the inner workings of how this all goes. We all give our candid opinions. There were many times Ambassador Bolton and I disagree. That's to be sure. But that's true for lots of people with whom I interact.
Okay, that is Pompeo basically shying off the question. Mnuchin suggested that there were fundamental foreign policy issues that were really at issue here, though, and that is where Bolton's ouster makes me a little bit nervous, to be honest with you. Here's Steve Mnuchin explaining.
The one thing I would just say, follow up, because the president's been very clear on this. The president's view of the Iraq war and Ambassador Bolton's was very different. The president's made that clear.
Okay, well, so what on the Iraq war? Unless that goes to a greater indicator of trouble, right, in the foreign policy establishment. Like, what exactly is Trump's foreign policy? So, a couple of signs that if you are hawkish on foreign policy, you should at least be somewhat worried. Maybe President Trump is going to swivel away from that toward a more isolationist pre-9/11 foreign policy. Tucker Carlson, who tends toward that side, was very excited that Bolton was ousted. And then he gave a very weird appraisal of Bolton that I frankly did not understand.
If you're wondering why so many progressives are mourning Bolton's firing tonight, it's because Bolton himself fundamentally was a man of the left. There was not a human problem John Bolton wasn't totally convinced could be solved with the brute force of government. That's an assumption of the left, not the right. Don't let the mustache fool you. John Bolton was one of the most progressive people in the Trump administration.
Okay, that is a very, very odd characterization of John Bolton as being on the left because he didn't want to cut a deal with the North Koreans, the Iranians, and the Taliban. And that's very weird. If the foreign policy looks more like Barack Obama than it does like George W. Bush, then I would suggest that foreign policy is not typically associated with the modern American right. It's certainly not the Reagan right. Right? Now, the truth is that the Republican Party has gone through vacillations historically on foreign policy. There was a more isolationist foreign policy pursued in the 1920s. There's a much more interventionist foreign policy pursued by Dwight Eisenhower. Richard Nixon was more of an interventionist. Ronald Reagan was more of an interventionist. George W. Bush ended up being an interventionist, even though he campaigned as more of an isolationist. But to characterize Bolton as on the left because he felt that sitting down with Hassan Rouhani and Kim Jong-un and the Taliban was a bad idea, not sure how that meshes or why that would be smart foreign policy. Rand Paul, who also tends towards isolationism on foreign policy, he was also very excited that Bolton was gone. He suggested that Bolton had increased the risk of war, which again is a weird take, specifically because there are two ways that America ends up in war. Sometimes we end up in preemptive war unnecessarily, but sometimes we end up in war because we end up having to react to the after effects of an isolationism we should never have pursued in the first place. Here's Rand Paul suggesting that John Bolton was a warmonger.
You know, I think the threat of war around the world is greatly diminished with Bolton out of the White House. I think he had a naive point of view for the world that we should topple regimes everywhere and institute, democratic governments, and we would make the world perfect or remake the world in our image. And frankly, it just doesn't work that way. There's a lot of history of getting rid of strong men in the Middle East and having them replaced by vacuums or chaos, or actually making the place more hospitable for terrorist training.
Now, again, I'm not sure that John Bolton would be advocating for just the defenestration of particular Middle Eastern strongmen. I tend to side with Bolton on foreign policy a lot. I'm very much opposed to the invasion of Libya on specifically these grounds. I thought the Arab Spring was a mistake specifically on a lot of these grounds. But if the Trump administration is getting rid of Bolton so they can cut deals with bad deals with bad guys, I'm not going to pretend that that's a great idea just because it's the Trump administration and not the Obama administration doing it. Okay, bringing the Taliban to Camp David was a terrible idea from the outset. Pretending that patting Kim Jong-un on the back is going to result in Kim Jong-un abandoning his nuclear missile aspirations, I think that is fairly naive. Cutting an Iran nuclear deal with the worst terror purveyors on planet Earth, that seems to me naive. So where do we go from here? Anybody's guess. I'm hoping, again, that this was just a personality clash, in which case Bolton's out, not a huge deal. But if it signals a sea change in foreign policy, that does concern me. Well, there's a new poll out from the Washington Post ABC News, and it shows President Trump trailing potential Democratic challengers. Now, is that something that he should be deeply worried about at this point in time? Well, not really, because again, President Trump has one specialty, and that specialty is taking people and dragging them through the mud, shoving their faces in the dirt, making them ingest that weird concoction of mud and dirt, and then placing them in front of voters all covered in mud. That's pretty much what Trump is best at, and he is phenomenal at it. It is a true skill set for President Trump. So all of the nice numbers for the Democrats right now, yeah, it's before Trump clocks them. As Mike Tyson once said, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the throat. And President Trump very much holds to that standard. The new poll tests Trump against 5 potential general election challengers. In 4 of those cases, the president trails significantly or modestly. He does worst against Joe Biden, but he's also running well behind Bernie Sanders and slightly behind Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris. Against Pete Buttigieg, basically he's tied. So right now, here is how he stacks up. Against Biden, he gets blown out according to this particular poll, 55-40. And that's a bad number. Okay, anytime you see your opponent doing better than 50%, that's never a great number. Against Sanders, 52-43. Against Warren, 51-44. Against Harris, 50-43. Against Pete Buttigieg, 47-43. Now, again, the margin of error here is plus or minus 4 percentage points. So he's basically tied with Buttigieg. And a 7-point lead could actually be a 3-point lead, depending on the margin of error and which way it swings, right? It could also be, if it's a 7-point lead, an 11-point lead, depending on how the margin of error swings. But one of the things that is a problem for Biden here is that Warren is polling well against Trump. His entire case, Joe Biden's, is I will definitely defeat Trump. Elizabeth Warren might lose. Well, if the polls keep showing that Elizabeth Warren could actually win, a lot of Democratic voters will say, well, why can't I have my cake, beating Trump, and eat it too with radical policy? Apparently, Sanders runs ahead of Trump by 9 points among registered voters, 12 points among all adults. Warren has a 7-point edge among registered voters, an 11-point lead among all adults. So registered voters are the ones you care about. It doesn't really matter how you poll among all adults. When it comes to registered voters, obviously Biden is blowing Trump out. And Biden is the most dangerous candidate in general. Why? Well, he's kind of weak and he's kind of old, but the media will swivel behind him and stop covering that stuff. And also, everybody basically has an opinion of Biden, and Biden's foibles make him less threatening, not more threatening. Elizabeth Warren's foibles are like, oh my God, maybe she's Stalin. Right? You look at Elizabeth Warren, it's like, well, she's kind of soft-spoken and she used to teach at Harvard. Probably. Oh my, what is she saying now? Joe Biden, his foibles are like, well, there's slow old Joe. And there he is walking into a tree again. Is that really all that threatening? Nah, he's like Mr. Magoo, just walking into trees, man. So his foibles actually cut in favor of him as default, not Trump. Elizabeth Warren is certainly not default, not Trump. Right now, this poll shows a dip in Trump's approval rating. Right now, he's at 38% in his approval rating, a decline of 6 points since July. Other public polls are tracking a similar dip in Trump's approval rating. On average, he's down to about 41% as opposed to 43% in June. Now, the bottom's not going to drop out on him here, but if the economy were to drop out, then he would be in serious, serious trouble. Favorability, the president currently stands at 40% positive, 57% negative. Now, again, all of this is before Trump digs into the Democrats. Like right now, for example, Bernie Sanders has a net positive rating of 12 points. That ain't going to last. Okay, Bernie Sanders is an octogenarian communist. That is not going to be his final approval number. Joe Biden has big approval numbers. Those are likely to be durable since, again, we all know who Joe Biden is, and he's a crazy old dude. That's pretty much it. Elizabeth Warren, her approval numbers are much, much weaker. And this is where Trump can do some heavy work on Elizabeth Warren. Right now, her favorables are 44% favorable, 38% unfavorable, 18% no opinion. Those are not great numbers for Elizabeth Warren. Because as Trump digs into her, and as Elizabeth Warren, it becomes clear that she is a manipulative radical, you're going to start to see those unfavorable numbers rise pretty dramatically. The general election matchups reveal a significant gender gap in 2020 choices. Trump runs statistically even with men when matched against Biden, at least slightly ahead against Warren, Sanders, Harris, and Buttigieg. Among women, however, Trump is just getting blown out. 30 points by Biden, that gender gap. 20 points against Sanders, Harris, and Warren, which again goes to the generalized point. President Trump needs to tone it down if he wishes to win re-election. Obviously, today marks the 18th anniversary. It's always weird to call it an anniversary of 9/11. Here to talk about that and a score of foreign policy issues is Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida. Senator Rubio, thanks so much for your time, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So why don't we begin with, obviously, some thoughts on 9/11, since it is the 18th anniversary. Do you think that America has forgotten some of the lessons of 9/11? What were those lessons, and what should we remember from that day?
Well, I think it's clearly, as time goes on after any incident, sort of the shock of the moment wears off. And that's why it's important to commemorate it every year. So those of us who lived through it or remember it at the time, remember what it felt like to feel so vulnerable. It's an event that really has defined the last 18 years. I mean, if you look at our foreign policy, it's been largely defined by it. I would say up until 2016 or 2017, our foreign policy was largely one aimed at counterterrorism.
Well, speaking about that, Senator Rubio, I do want to ask you, a little bit about that. I mean, it seems like there's this rift opening up. It was already between right and left, but now it seems to be opening up on the right about whether we ought to refocus our foreign policy away from a sort of interventionist, stop them there before they get here foreign policy and toward a more reactive, quasi-isolationist foreign policy. Do you see that same rift appearing here, or do you think that that's overstated?
Yeah, that's not necessarily new, although I think it's gained more currency in Republican circles as well. But I think there's a more interesting development, and that is a transition that's occurring from sort of a counterterrorism-focused foreign policy to one more focused on great power competition increasingly between the United States and China. which is not like the Cold War, but it's more similar to it in the sense that you do now have, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, a nation state that's a near-peer competitor, and that we have to gear our foreign policy towards. Obviously, there are elements of counterterrorism that are still alive. I can tell you that there are multiple terrorist groups around the world that continue to plan, plot, and try to inspire attacks against the United States, including here in the homeland, and that threat remains. But it's now coupled with this sort of new challenge that we face from China on a number of fronts that I think are going to end up defining the century.
Well, let's talk about that, because you had an article in the Washington Post, you had an op-ed in the Washington Post about a week ago talking about China and Hong Kong and what our position should be on China. The United States is in this weird position where China owns a lot of our debt. We trade a lot with China. At the same time, China is incredibly aggressive on the world stage with their Belt and Road program, with their pursuit of 5G. What should America's policy toward China look like, given the fact that we may, in fact, be in an unstated Cold War that we refuse to acknowledge?
So I think that's a fundamental question in foreign policy today. And my argument has been this is not about containing China or in any way it's not about what they think it is. That's how they view it. I think it's about rebalancing our relationship. We have a dangerous imbalance developing in our relationship, primarily because we have allowed them to frankly cheat when it comes to trade and commerce, because we viewed them as an emerging or a developing country that once they became wealthy and more like us would behave more like us, and it didn't work out that way. And in the process, we have figured out that now they are, in essence, trying to supplant us on some of the key industries that will define the 21st century. Hong Kong is interesting because in the case of Hong Kong, irrespective of sort of the broader China policies that I'm talking about, Hong Kong enjoys special status. Like when you see these tariffs that are applying, for example, to products out of China, they don't apply to things that come out of Hong Kong because they are autonomous. And that's what the Chinese pledged when the handover happened. And what they are slowly trying to do is erode that autonomy. And this latest effort was the extradition bill, where they could actually extradite people from Hong Kong into the mainland to stand trial. And so they can't have it both ways. You can't enjoy the benefits of Hong Kong's autonomy, but at the same time not adhere to it. And so as much as anything else, that's one of the reasons why we should care. And the other, frankly, is, look, we can't impose democracy. And frankly, there are nations that are at a state in their development or what have you that can't actually bring that about at this moment. But wherever there is democracy and wherever in the world people speak in favor of the principles that our nation was founded on, we should support them. Sometimes that support is moral support. Sometimes it's policy support. That doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be an invasion. We're not going to go to war with China, but there are things we need to do. And one of them is, I hope, pass my bill, which requires the State Department every year to answer the question, is Hong Kong still autonomous? Because if it isn't, then why does China get to enjoy the benefits of that autonomy?
Senator Rubio, what exactly would be the ramifications if we were to recognize that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous? I mean, the withdrawal of the British in the 1990s from Hong Kong and turnover of the territory to the Chinese with certain guarantees that it would basically be allowed to function in autonomous fashion. Obviously, that has been encroached upon increasingly. It appears that the Chinese government is going to continue to encroach upon that. What tools does America have at our disposal to thwart the efforts of the Chinese in expanding their power, influence, and aggression?
Well, Hong Kong is a very useful place for them. They move business operations there for purposes of not, if a company faces restrictions for export of products or services from China, they don't face them when Hong Kong is treated as a separate nation for that purpose. And so I think the biggest ramification would be that even the companies in Hong Kong would now be treated as they're located in the mainland of China. And that's particularly important to do if, in fact, the Chinese now control the political life in Hong Kong. And so I think that's why it would be justified if it ever reached that point.
Well, Senator Rubio, I want to change topics briefly and just ask for your brief opinion on the ouster of John Bolton over at the White House. What do you make of that? There seem to be a couple of different stories. One is that it was just a personality clash. The other is that there were serious ideological clashes inside the administration. It seems, sort of like a black box over there, impossible to tell what exactly went on. What do you hope went on? What do you think went on?
Well, look, I think that clearly there are some ideological differences between the president and Ambassador Bolton, but that's probably true of a handful of other people that work around them as well. I think I think the bigger issue from what I take is that there was a lot of internal friction around it, and something must have happened in conjunction with the proposed Taliban meeting and then cancellation that ultimately was the final straw. There were press reports that it had to do with leaking. I don't know any of that. Here's the bottom line: is John Bolton is an employee of the executive branch. He's not Senate confirmed. He works for the president, and works for the president. It doesn't work for us. I like John Bolton a lot. I work well with him, very closely with him. We share a lot of views and in common and so forth. And I thought, at least certainly from the things I believe in, he did a very good job. But, he himself was probably not going to be there much longer anyways. I mean, he was looking to probably end at the end. So we would be facing this one way or the other. And look, at the end of the day, the president has a right to have people working for him and I think John Bolton would be the first one to say it. He has a right to have someone in that position that he wants in that position. Can't be effective as a national security advisor. The president is no longer trusting your judgment or listening to you for whatever reason, personal, ideological, or both. So I don't know the full detail. I'm not privy to it, but now someone else will be serving in that role, and we hope it'll be someone real good.
We're speaking with Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. Senator Rubio, I wanted to ask you about that proposed Taliban meeting in Afghanistan. What do you think Afghan policy should look like going forward? Obviously, there's this vast debate over whether we should try to cut a deal with the Taliban or whether we should just draw down some of our troops there without trying to cut a deal with the Taliban. What do you think that should look like?
Well, I think it's important to, number one, remember why we were there in the first place, and that is that when the Taliban last ruled that country, they provided a safe haven for terror organizations to plot to attack us. The place from which the 9/11 attacks originated was Afghanistan, under the protection and auspices of the Taliban, who hosted al-Qaeda. And so we need to ask ourselves whether returning to that is in America's national interest, because I can assure you that whether it's al-Qaeda or any of its successor groups, were to establish a foothold in Afghanistan, the number one target in the world for them it would be the United States of America. The drawdown question, people like to debate the numbers all the time. The issue about the drawdown is this: you do reach a point in which you don't have enough people to even defend themselves. So that's why the number there matters. As far as negotiating with the Taliban is concerned, that's a tough, bitter pill to swallow. Number one, their ideology is anti-American, radical. I'm not in favor of an endless war. That's not what I want. I don't want our presence to be there forever. I think we have to balance that with what would the world look like if we were to completely withdraw and within a number of weeks or months the Taliban took over. And it's my view that what it would look like is it would once again be a safe haven and operating space for radical elements to now be able to target us. That has been the history of terrorism. They look for safe operating spaces from which they can conduct attacks against the United States. And by the way, there are new hotspots emerging in that front. Al-Shabaab in Africa has external plotting ambitions now. The Philippines has become a hotspot for ISIS activity. We saw what ISIS was able to do when they took advantage of the vacuum that was created in Syria when that upheaval took place. ISIS had nothing to do with the revolt against Assad, but they took advantage of that because it created an operating space for them. And we just need to be cognizant that these radical Sunni groups are constantly looking for safe operating space to attack America.
Well, Senator Rubio, I really appreciate your time and your insight. Really, thank you again, and we'll check in with you soon, sir.
All right, thank you for having me on.
Obviously, today marks the 18th anniversary, and it's always a weird word to use when you're talking about something horrific that happened, but it's the 18th anniversary of 9/11. Joining us on the line to discuss the legacy of 9/11, what 9/11 meant to the country, and how we should think about 9/11 going forward is Representative Dan Crenshaw of Texas. He obviously served as a Navy SEAL for about a decade before being elected to Congress in 2019. Dan, thanks so much for joining the show.
Yeah, it was great to be with you, Ben.
So let's talk for a second about what you remember on 9/11. We all sort of have our personal memories of where we were when the planes first hit the World Trade Center towers. What was your experience on 9/11?
Well, I was in high school. It wasn't clear to us what was really going on. And, so I went to high school in Bogota, Colombia. My dad was in the oil industry growing up. And so we were living overseas at the time. And we didn't have a good connection to the cable news. We couldn't. I specifically remember seeing static on the TV as we were trying to figure out what was going on. There was talk of an accident that happened in New York, so there wasn't a lot of commotion in the high school, and then it became clear what actually had happened, and and we just had to soak it in. We're high school kids. I'm not I'm not sure we knew how to deal with that. And it was a little different for me because I was in a different country. My homeland had been attacked, and I wasn't there. It didn't affect my decision to go in the military. I had wanted to go in the military for years already. It was always my goal. It strengthened that decision, I think, and it gave me a realization that I would certainly have a job to do once I got there.
Now, Dan, what do you think are the lessons of 9/11 for the American people? And do you think that we have begun to forget what exactly 9/11 reminded us of? I've talked at length about the feeling that I think a lot of Americans had in the aftermath of 9/11, which was we can't retreat from the world, and if we do, there's a vacuum that will be filled by the world's worst people. And now it feels like we've been reopening that debate really since the election of 2008. Do you feel like we are moving away from some of the lessons that we learned after 9/11, or do we have a more developed and mature view of what happened on 9/11? Was it an outlier or the effect of an isolationist or withdrawing from the world foreign policy?
Yeah, there's almost two questions there. One is a cultural question. The other is a foreign policy question. And the answer is yes to both. Like we've moved away from the lessons we've learned on both fronts. And the cultural question, it's more of a matter of we're all Americans. We're in this together. It really is us and our interests versus the enemies that want to kill us. I think we have forgotten that lesson a little bit. And obviously right now we're just more divided than ever. On the foreign policy question, we've certainly forgotten that as well. 9/11 was it was a result of a lot of different intelligence failures. I don't know that it's a result of isolationism per se. I think it was just bad decisions that maybe we couldn't have perfectly foreseen. We always want to explain things. We always want to blame somebody. The reality is that there's enemies out there that want to kill us, and it's not exactly logical. Their reasoning is not exactly logical. It's based on this. It's based on this really hateful ideology. I always say this. I'm like, why is it that Osama bin Laden wanted to kill us? We supported his people in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We defended his homeland, Saudi Arabia, against Saddam Hussein. Like, what is it this guy has against us? And again, it's not logical. He just hates us. They hate us because of who we are, because of our Judeo-Christian history, because of our Western values. They just hate us. And so it's really hard for a lot of Americans to understand that. And we're moving further and further away from it. And I think it used to be a left versus right thing, but now it's definitely on both sides. The left and the right have this false notion that if we just leave them alone, they'll stop going to war with us. And I don't know what that argument is based on. It's, I try to read through the arguments when these things are put out there. And it's really based on this basic notion that we've been there too long and it's really hard. And so therefore it's a bad idea. And what have we gotten for it? Well, I'll answer that very clearly. What have we gotten for it? We've gotten 18 years without another 9/11. That's what we've gotten for it. We have to understand that. We have to be honest with the American people when we're trying to explain why we're still involved in places like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan.
I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is that people have begun treating 9/11 like it was an isolated data point as opposed to the sort of apotheosis of a series of terror attacks that had taken place from 1998 on. Obviously, we saw our embassies attacked in Tanzania and Kenya. We saw the USS Cole attacked the year before. We saw the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. And people seem to have sort of written 9/11 out of history in a data-based way. They say this was an outlier that, all right, so let's say that we have to accept a low level of terrorism. Maybe that's just what we have to accept in return for not having our troops all over the world. That seems to me at least an argument. I'm not sure that it's a very good argument, and I think it also mistakes the purpose of the U.S. military. Now, it's hard for me to say that because obviously you made the infinitely braver and more valuable decision to join the military. I didn't do that. But what do you make of that argument that basically the costs are too high, that we should try to bring as many troops as possible home as soon as possible, and if that means that we take a certain low level of background terrorism noise, then that means that's what happens?
Yeah, I think the people making that argument are also trying to have it both ways. Again, they actually believe that if we just leave them alone, they'll leave us alone. As if warfare has to take two parties. It doesn't. It only one person has to engage in warfare. And Al Qaeda has their priorities, and one of those priorities is always attacking the homeland. They're still one of the best financed terror groups in the world. So, it's based off a false premise in the first place. It's also based on some sort of sense of moral superiority. Like, I think the people making that argument think that they're saying, bring the boys home. These poor troops, they're out there, they're defending poppy fields in Afghanistan, and they don't know why. No, we do know why. We're not victims. We're volunteers. And every single day I miss doing that job because I really did understand what it was for. And it wasn't always clear in that moment, right? When you're walking across a field in the middle of nowhere in Helmand Province and a bomb blows up in your face, it's not always clear in that moment. And maybe we need to redefine our strategy continuously. We should be. We should always be questioning that. But what I think is clear is the notion that we do need a residual presence there, because you do have to be able to take the fight to the enemy quickly and put pressure on them there, because they are always trying to fight us here. And that's just a truth that we have not done a good job explaining to the American people. And I think that's why we see, again, both sides, the left and the right, really, really skeptical of this notion that we should be involved anywhere at all.
We're speaking with Representative Dan Crenshaw of Texas. Representative Crenshaw, obviously, you've seen the stories over the last week about the possibility of negotiations with the Taliban. The Trump administration was apparently even considering bringing the leadership of the Taliban to Camp David to possibly sign some sort of agreement, even in the absence of the leadership of the Afghan government. This seemed like an awful idea from the very start to me. President Trump then rejected it rightly, but he did so on the basis of a recent terror attack as opposed to, the Taliban being the Taliban. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about this whole thing.
Yeah, I could have told everybody that the Taliban were untrustworthy, after I got a bomb blown up in my face. and after every day that every other day you're seeing them just indiscriminately killing civilians, their own people, right? Their own people. I mean, this is the type of people that they are. It speaks to a misunderstanding of what's really going on in Afghanistan. Like it's just this battle between the Taliban and the government. Well, there's a lot more actors in that playing field, right? Like between Al Qaeda, ISIS, the Haqqani network. There's all of these players. It will devolve into the pretty terrible warfare, and that gives the strongest, I think most dedicated terrorist elements the time and the space to actually plan against us, because we're no longer paying attention to them. And so it's hard to see that go any other direction. And it's hard to understand how we could possibly, even if the Taliban kept their word, possibly expect them to actually do what we're asking them to do, which is prevent terrorist safe havens. I mean, I just don't think that's a realistic expectation, even if they were negotiating in good faith.
Well, Representative Crenshaw, thanks so much for your time. Of course, as always, thanks so much for your service. It's Representative Dan Crenshaw from Texas. Really appreciate it, sir. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ben.
Well, folks, on this 9/11, again, remember 9/11. Never forget what America is, why America is good, why America is a force for good in the world. And remember both the victims and the brave people who stepped forward to save people on that day and then serve ever since. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.